Again, welcome to tonight's program. It's going to be presented by Catherine Prescott. She's Chief Curator at Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center, and Mary Tsaltas-Ottomanelli, Education and Public Programs Coordinator at Fraunces Tavern Museum. They will talk about the history of apples in colonial taverns and beyond. I am now going to turn it over to Catherine.
Yes, welcome to Keeler's Tavern. I'm sitting at the bar end of the Keeler tap room, and we'll start off our presentation with making a drink that perhaps you might have been able to get if you visited Timothy Keeler's tavern in the 18th century. So the drink we're making tonight is called a stone fence, and it is spirits and hard cider. And generally the spirits would be applejack or rum, which were very common drinks in the 18th century. So it's 2 parts spirit, 5 parts cider. So I'm going to have applejack because we are doing apples tonight. I figured let's do everything apples. So I've got my 2 ounces of applejack, and then I will then add 5 ounces of cider here. All right, so 5 ounces of my cider. And then in the 19th century, people started adjusting this recipe, and they started adding bitters like Angostura bitters. So you can do that as well. And lastly, we're going to garnish our cocktail here. And you could use mint, lemon peel, but since we are in Connecticut, we are the nutmeg state, I'm going to add a little bit of nutmeg to my stone fence here. So I put a little bit of nutmeg there, and that's a stone fence. So cheers. I hope you'll all join me in having some apple beverages, just like our forefathers and foremothers would have been drinking in the 18th century. Now, before we move on, a little bit about the stone fence, because I was looking into this, I thought it was interesting. And one of the reasons I chose this particular drink to share with you all is because it featured in a it featured in the American Revolution in the early days. So Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys generally stayed up in Vermont. They had their usual watering hole at the Catamount Tavern in Burlington. But in May of 1775, they headed over to Lake Champlain, and they spent a few days at Remington's Tavern, just outside of Ticonderoga. And while there, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys drank several of these drinks, these stone fences, in the days before their very successful raid on Fort Ticonderoga in May of 1775. So don't know if this particular beverage helped them along with that successful raid, but I thought that was a very interesting story that went along with this drink. Now, you might wonder, why is it called a stone fence? And I discovered a couple of different stories about the origin of this name. The most common story was that it was called a stone fence because the effect of having one too many of these drinks was akin to running downhill into one of New England's ubiquitous stone fences. So drink responsibly, please. But I do hope if you have made it, let us know if you enjoy it. I know, and let us know if you made it with applejack or rum. I know applejack is not very common anymore, so it might be a new taste for some of you.
I think one of my favorite nicknames that I found for Applejack is kind of like a stone fence. It was essence of lockjaw or horn of gunpowder, and my favorite was corpse reviver. So if you needed to know what kind of drink Applejack is, it's 100 proof. It's a very strong drink. So if you, again, drink too much of it and get too excited, you will hit a stone fence. It all comes back.
So because Applejack is not terribly well known anymore, I thought some people might not actually know how Applejack is made, because a true Applejack is different from other distilled liquors in that Applejack is made by jacking apple cider. And jacking is just another term for freeze distillation. So normal liquors are made with steam distillation. You heat up the liquid, and the alcohol actually evaporates before the rest of the water and all that. So that's how you distill whiskey or rum or things like that. Applejack is done in a different way. It's frozen, and the water in the apple cider will freeze, and the alcohol gets left behind. And then you would scoop it out that way. So traditional Applejack is made that way. I don't think commercial Applejack is allowed to be made with freeze distillation anymore. So modern Applejack that you would buy at the liquor store is actually technically cider brandy. It's steam distilled, but it's made from apple cider, so we're calling it Applejack. And it tastes the same, apparently. All right. I have next.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the kinds of drinks that were made out of apples a little bit more?
Sure.
The classic, if I may, apple cider, unto which maybe the green screen will help me and you guys can see my angry apple orchard.
Yeah, so the most common drink that was made out of apples is cider, and the United States is actually very unique in the fact that in modern times, at least, when we say cider, we're talking about something kind of like apple juice, right? It's non-alcoholic. Generally, we talk about fresh pressed cider, but for most of history and for most of the rest of the world, when you say cider, it refers to an alcoholic beverage. And it is basically our soft cider that's been allowed to ferment using the natural yeast that are on the outside of the apples. And one of the reasons that apple cider was so ubiquitous in the North American colonies is because apples grew really well, especially in New England, but all up and down the East Coast. So if we go way back and talk about where apples come from, the domesticated apple is actually native to Central Asia. And the seeds were brought to Europe along the Silk Road. And then from Europe, they were brought by European settlers to North America. Now, North America did have like crab apples, which are different species than the domesticated apple. So Europeans brought the apple that we know today to North America. But the thing about apples is they're what's called an extreme heterozygote. So humans are heterozygotes, like we get, traits from both of our parents. So apples do the same thing. They cannot self-pollinate on the same plant. So you do need pollinators to bring new genetic material. And if you plant a seed from one apple tree, the fruit that the new tree will make could be completely different. It likely will be completely different from its parent tree. So every time you plant a new apple seed, you're going to get a different type, a different variety of apple. And so by the end of the 1800s, there were approximately 14,000 different types of apples available or being grown in North America, just because people were planting so many trees in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so most of these apples are not very good for eating or for cooking, right? So they're either too bitter, or they're too sweet, or they're too soft and mealy, or they're too hard, right? There's like a sweet spot that's a good eating apple. But most of these apples are actually really good for pressing for cider. So a lot of the apples that are being grown in the 18th century are going to be for making cider. And cider is also the best way to preserve apples for long-term consumption, right? So, so that's how cider kind of expanded throughout the North American colonies and kind of became the standard beverage of the 13 colonies.
Yeah, it's amazing to see just how readily available apples were and the many uses for it, because I think today, you know, I had an apple for breakfast and I didn't think twice about it. But when you think about how common they were, because everybody was expected to have, if you had some sort of farmland, to have some sort of orchard, and you most definitely would have either had apples or pears on them. So you take these apples, you're either making cider, so you have some sort of like clean drink that you can have, because water will most likely make you sick at this time. You use the excess as like dried apples. They were making apple sauce and apple butter, which are all delicious things that we all still eat today. And it was supposed to help you get through winter. So you're harvesting a lot of these during the early fall for the winter time, which is, I mean, dried apples keep great in a cellar, as do the apple sauces and the apple butter. So they were nutritious, delicious, and they were preserved pretty well, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah. Apples are kind of this, you know, all purpose. Yeah. Many different uses.
I did like the apple cider vinegar as well. It can be used for cleaning purposes as well. So literally your entire house.
Yeah.
Catherine, we have a question from the audience. Was the apple cider always high proof?
So apple cider has maximum alcohol by volume of 10%. That's kind of the max you can ferment true apple cider. But if you are making further distilling that into Applejack, you are going to get to 100 proof, which is 50% alcohol by volume. So Applejack is definitely very high proof. I think modern day Applejack is not quite 100 proof. The Applejack that I have is 80 proof. I think that's about what the max you can sell in the United States too. So there's some of that. But so yes, Applejack is always very high proof. Apple cider is generally about, you know, it's about what a wine is. Thereabouts. I think modern commercial hard cider is about at the 5-6%.
Mine is at 5. Mine says 5.
Yeah.
Not too bad.
Yeah. So yeah, it's you know, there is, just like with any beverage, there's kind of the different levels of amount of alcohol you get and the different varieties and things like that.
So how was apple cider made?
So that's a very good question. So apple cider is made by pressing the juice out of apples. So the way you do it, it's actually it's not as simple as just pressing apples and squeezing juice out of it. There is a whole process that needs to be done. And so what you do is you collect all your apples, and depending on the sources I found, some people said you have to be very careful and only collect, you know, pick the apples off the tree. Other people say that windfall is fine and apples that have fallen off the tree due to wind or whatever, are fine. So you collect your apples and then you have to crush them and kind of make them into this mash that's called pumice, or apple cheese. And you either grind them up or you crush them with like a stick or a mill. And I'm going to share my screen because I have a very nice picture of an apple mill. Oh, these are a lot of different varieties of apples. I'll come back to that. But here's a painting from the 1840s of cider making. And so if you look in the background, you can see there's a horse pulling a big wheel, and the whole apples would have been put into this pit here, and the wheel is pulled around by the horse, and your apples are all crushed up into this mash. And then the mash, the apple pumice, is layered between layers of straw into the press, and then a big heavy weight is lowered on top of all of that crushed apple. And that weight is going to slowly squeeze out all the apple cider. So there were two kinds of presses that were pretty common throughout history, I've found. There's the kind shown here, which is a lever press. You can see the gentleman all the way on the my right, and he's kind of pushing on a stick, and that's lowering the weight to press out all the apple cider. There's also the screw press, where you would, there's a large screw and you can screw it down from the top and the weight would lower that way. And a lot of modern, at least small cider mills, so if you go to kind of your local orchard that makes their own apple cider, they probably have one of those two types of cider presses. So once you've pressed your apples, you're going to drain off all of that liquid that's going to come out the bottom and put it into barrels. So you see that kind of center in the back. He's putting the cider into barrels, and then you will let that ferment until you need it, really. And a single apple tree can produce enough apples in a season for about 6 to 8 barrels of cider. So you're going to have plenty of cider to last you until the next fall.
Were there any side products made of any one of the leftovers here, or?
Yeah, so you can actually, so I've been saying that this cider is kind of a ubiquitous drink and everyone was drinking it. And it's true, men, women, and children were drinking cider, even the alcoholic cider. However, after the first pressing of the apples, you would take this leftover apple cheese that's now kind of in a solid mass, and then you could soak it in water and press it again. And no matter how long you let that ferment, you're just going to get a very weak alcoholic content. And so that's a beverage called ciderkin, and that's often what's given to children, is this second pressing, which is a much weaker type of beverage. Obviously, you've pressed out the first set of juices from the apples. So we have ciderkin that's made out of the second pressing. And then after that, typically you're going to take your apple cheese and feed it to your pigs, because they're the 18th century disposal unit. So because there's really nothing left in the apple cheese after you've gotten the ciderkin. So that's how you make apple cider, and that's the same way that apple cider is made up to today. There's really no difference in the way you do it. One thing that's very important, though, is when you'll notice how this is all kind of outdoors and it's open. because it was believed that you wanted to let the apples, before you press them, they needed to turn brown. They needed to be exposed to air and the sun, and turn that brown color that you get when apples are exposed to air, because that is developing the sugars. So if you want sweet apple cider, you got to let your apples brown out in the open for a little bit.
So what would Timothy have offered at his tavern?
So mostly Timothy would have offered apple cider, right? And it probably came from his own orchard. And most rural families had a handful of trees at the very least. They would have, 2 or 3 trees at the minimum. And some families might, if they're able to afford it, they might actually have their own small press as well, or you would have a communal cider mill. Grist mills often doubled as cider mills, and have a press on hand. So apple cider for sure was at Timothy's Tavern. Every tavern in the 13 colonies was going to be serving cider and probably a beer, like a small beer, so a weak beer. Anything else, the brandies and the rums and the whiskeys or the wines that's special, that costs a little bit more. So depending on the tavern, they might have it, but every tavern in North America is going to have cider available.
So what about the Fraunces Tavern, Mary? I mean, how did that work? Did you guys have orchards in your backyard, or?
Not so much the backyard, but there definitely was a lot of fields. The landscape of New York City in the 18th century was, believe it or not, farmland. I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. Up until about the early 1800s, New York City's uptown was basically where City Hall Park is. So if you're familiar with New York City and you've been to New York City, if you've seen St. Paul's and you've seen City Hall Park, you were literally in orchard fields and farmlands, and you were considered living uptown. So everybody that lived in New York City, that 25,000, 30,000 population, was packed all the way downtown. So when you have a tavern on the waterfront, like Samuel Fraunces did, you're on Dock Street, there's ships coming into the harbor 24/7, you have the perfect amount of people to come into your tavern to want to have cider. And because he was a very good businessman, he had any kind of liquor or ale or some sort of cider in his tavern. Probably I wasn't able to find, you guys are very lucky because you have Timothy Keeler's ledgers and all those other notes, but I wish that we had some of Samuel's kind of like recipe books or ledgers or some sort, because I know that he would have definitely had this and served it, but I don't have any proof other than historical doubt. I do have a couple of images just to show you the relationship to the Delanceys as well. So I will share my screen with you. So one of my favorite pieces, we'll start at the third picture because that's probably the better one, is the plan of the city of New York in North America. This is our Ratzner map. So we do have one of these we had one on display, excuse me, it went away and I'm devastated. It's such a beautifully detailed image of New York City. So the bottom left hand, so you can see my cursor, this is where Fraunces Tavern is located. So we are literally at the very tip of Manhattan. We are all the way at the bottom. You can see all of the harbor over here, all the ships coming in. And then as you start to get uptown, which is always funny to say, you start getting into the commons. You can see the freshwater pond is over here, the collect is over here. And then, so the original owners of 54 Pearl are the Delancey family. They filled in the land because we were on landfill, decided that by the time that the house was built, because there were so many harbors, so many people coming in, so much noise and so much commerce, that they didn't want to live in the building anymore. So they never actually lived in 54 Pearl. They ended up selling that and moving all the way uptown to what is today the Lower East Side. So if you've ever been to Delancey Street, that's them. That is the Delancey family. They were known loyalists, always important to point out, at a patriotic bar. So they were on the wrong side of history. Ha, ha, ha. You can see some of the names on those streets. One of them is still existing today, which is Orchard Street. So the Delanceys had a 300-acre farmland. So part of the square was all of theirs. And it was because it was such a common thing, they definitely would have had some sort of apple orchard, pear orchard, of the like on that property. And they would have definitely either sold the apples, or they would have had somebody come in to produce some sort of cider to sell, because I mean, why wouldn't you? You're not going to let those apples go to waste. And then this is a great image of Brooklyn. So you can literally see full farmland on this. This is all open fields, open farmlands. This is again still from the Ratzner map as well. It's beautifully detailed. So if you ever have a chance to come see one in real life, they are fabulous, and they're one of my favorite educational teaching tools for New York City. And then this one is a great indication of just how small New York City was, the city itself that was populated, and how big the rest of the island was with farmland, because you can honestly see all of the different plots of land. So up until about here is city population, city life, urban life, and then as you start to get out, it's all beautiful farmland.
Those maps are great.
I know. Who doesn't love a good map?
Yeah, they're really great.
I love a good map.
Yeah, so Mary, you mentioned Timothy's ledgers, which we are very lucky to have. But I think one of the really interesting things about it is the ledgers we have are mostly his retail, like his store ledgers, not the tavern ledgers. And so we're seeing what kind of things that Timothy's buying in New York City to resell here in Ridgefield, and what the people of Ridgefield are buying to use at their own homes, right? Not necessarily what they're drinking here at the tavern. And so I went through several of these ledgers trying to find, like, you know, apple related things, or is there cider? Is he selling cider? Is he selling, you know, what anything related to it? And I found one record, you know, because most people have their own apple orchards on their farms, right? So they don't need to buy apples. They don't need to, you know, buy cider. But we do have, let me go, which way is it? Here we go. So here is a ledger. So on the right-hand side of, or my right, I guess your left, I don't know, my right, is a ledger that of Timothy's, where we have Gamaliel Northrup, his name's at the very top. He is paying off some of the debt he has accumulated at Timothy's store by making barrels of cider. So you can see right at the very bottom, it's kind of highlighted, on October 17th and November 1st of 1775, there are two instances where Gamaliel Northrup is paying off some of his debt by making barrels of cider. And he pays off, it's about 1 shilling a barrel is what the rate was at this time. And we are also very lucky that in our archives, we have the corresponding day book for this ledger. So you can see the other two photos are those entries in the day book. So that's where Timothy would have recorded it just off, jotted down, you know, all his business that was happening that day. And then that in the evening, he would then put it into the ledger to make sure that everybody's accounts were up to date. So I was really excited to see that we have both of these. We see the day book record and then the matching record in the ledger. But in all of the ledgers we have, which covers about 1772 to past Timothy's death in 1815, this is pretty much the only reference to cider in the entire, all of the ledgers. And I think it's just because everyone was managing on their own. You know, they had their own apples, they had their, you know, cider presses and mills and things like that. So they, you know, were not using apples or purchasing apples for cider or things like that. So I think it's always interesting to see not only what's in documents, but also what's missing from documents.
Catherine, remind us the currency that's being used here for recording, purchases.
Yeah, so all of Timothy Keeler's ledgers use what's called York money. So it would have been the currency of New York, which is recorded of the province of New York, which is recorded in pounds, shillings, and pence. So this particular page in the ledger is from 1775. So there is continental, the Continental Congress is issuing its own money, but it's practically worthless. Nobody really wants it. So people are still using, if you're paying cash, you're still using either British pounds or Spanish gold and silver. And nobody's really using, American, quote unquote, American dollars. And Timothy, for his entire life, he doesn't record any of his transactions in dollars. So even past the revolution, all the way up until 1815, he's still recording all of his accounting in pounds, shillings, pence, which is very frustrating for me when I want to check his math, but
you just
Catherine, what are the years when Timothy ran the tavern?
So Timothy ran the tavern opened around 1772. We don't know exactly the date, but the very first ledger we have of Timothy's, and he labels it his first ledger, is from October of 1772. So that's kind of the earliest date that he was really doing business. And he only purchased the house that the tavern's in 1769. So we think he purchased the house, he got married the following year, and then by 1772, he's starting to sell things out of the house and starting up the tavern. The first actual reference we have to the tavern is in this ledger, and it's from 1778, where somebody is paying off debt to Timothy by actually tending the tavern. They were like substitute bartender. So that's like the first official, we know for sure the tavern was running by 1778. So sometime within that 72 to 78 period is when the tavern officially opened.
Interesting. What about apples as a food? That might have been served at taverns.
You had, like I mentioned, definitely like dried apples or the applesauce to be served as sides. I went looking to probably the best source for cooking is the American Cookery Book, which was the first recipe book published in the United States in 1796. I think between me and Catherine, we were able to find kind of apple pie adjacent is probably the best words to describe them, of like they kind of resemble what we eat today as apple pie or apple crumbs, kind of using the same process and ingredients, but almost you knew that they were not modern in a way. I think Catherine found the more interesting one though, definitely.
I don't know. I mean, there's a bunch of different recipes that kind of, they're, like Mary said, they're like almost something we recognize, but there'd be like something just slightly off. So one of the recipes that I found in a lot of different cookbooks, both from England and that kind of show up in American cookbooks later on, is called an apple tansy, which is sort of like fried apples covered in a custard-like thing and baked, which is interesting. And then apple pies, we do have kind of precursors to apple pies. The Puritans were known to make apple pie with dried apples that they kind of reconstitute and stew and then bake in crust. But I think the recipe that people are most familiar with, that's kind of an 18th century recipe, might be the apple pandowdy.
I love that name.
So the apple pandowdy is it's almost like a crumb or an apple crisp, except so this part, the name dowdy, comes from Old English or Middle English, and it means like to cut and so your crust on this pandowdy is kind of just cut up into pieces and shingled over the top of some stewed apples. And then you're going to bake it, and all these juices are going to come out, and then you press the crust in to the juices so it flows over the top and it caramelizes on top of the crust. And it's really good. And it is apparently Abigail Adams's favorite dessert, was this apple pandowdy. So I saw a couple references that there was a recipe that they know is Abigail Adams's, and the National Archives published like a modern version of it for their 4th of July celebration this year. So I think, when I send out the survey tomorrow, I'll also send out Abigail Adams's pandowdy recipe, and we can all try it.
I 100% saw a couple of people just go, ooh, when you described what it was, because I was like, that I can smell it from here. It's a Yankee Candle scent, and I got it.
Yeah, so it's really good. My family actually makes apple pandowdy for Thanksgiving and Christmas dessert. So we love it. And the one thing about Abigail Adams's recipe, at least the recipe that's called Abigail Adams's recipe, is that unlike almost every other pandowdy recipe I've seen, it has a bottom crust. Most pandowdy recipes are just a top crust. Like you put your apples in a deep dish, like a deep pan, and then you just put the crust on top. But the Abigail Adams recipe does have a bottom crust. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, if you're cooking it actually over fire, there's a little more heat on the bottom. And I wonder if that bottom crust is to protect the apples from scorching on the bottom of the pan. So I thought that was something I was like really trying to figure out. I was like, why does she have such a different apple pandowdy recipe than every other one I've seen?
It just sounds like you've got to do a demo at Keeler Tavern to find out. That's all I'm hearing.
Yeah.
That's all I hear.
If only we had a hearth that we could cook on. That would
It does make sense that would be Abigail Adams's favorite recipe, just because when you read about John Adams, his favorite thing to do every morning since his days at Harvard were a big old, kind of like your Keeler Tavern mug there, that big old thing of hard apple cider every morning, because he swore by it, and it had a lot of health properties. It was supposed to get rid of like your arthritis. It was supposed to be good for inflammation and gout and all that other stuff. I mean, he lived into his 90s, so maybe he was definitely onto something.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, he was fairly portly, so maybe the apple cider helped. He
just had too much pie with Abigail. That's all it was. It wasn't the drink, it was the pie.
It was the pie.
It was definitely the pie.
Mary, what are some of the other presidential connections?
Who didn't have a connection to apples in the 18th century? One of my favorites, it's apple adjacent, but it was the Washington, for context, it's frowned upon today, but when you wanted to get people to vote for you, you bribed them very openly at a tavern. I know, hear me out. I would be okay if somebody offered me like free lunch for a vote these days. You were typically, because your voting station would be at a common place and a gathering place like a tavern, you were expected to have food and drink. So the first time George Washington goes and runs for the House of Burgesses in Virginia at 24 or 25, he's like, no, I don't need it. Loses. The second time, he comes so prepared with every kind of liquor, and he gave barrels and barrels and barrels away of hard apple cider. And you know what? He won that second time. So I'm just saying, maybe somebody's got to start giving away hard apple cider at election time. Easiest way to win over a New Yorker is free food. Maybe,
Not just New Yorkers. So.
I'm just saying, we've got a mayoral race coming up soon.
Hint, hint.
Definitely a lot of founding fathers loved their apples, like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, because on Monticello had such a big property, also had orchards. He loved his apples. He was very like proud of them. He made several statements about how like the American apple is so much, I forgot the wording. It was a very funny quote. I have it somewhere. I have to go find it. Was so much better than any kind of European apple he could possibly find. Like he was like, the American ones are so much better. I don't know what you guys are doing across the Atlantic Ocean. He produced so much, and anytime anybody ever came to Monticello, he would give such a large amount of ale to them, and hard cider, excuse me, that he actually ran out one winter and he had to go to his neighbor's house to get extra for a party that he was about to throw, because he didn't understand that you have to like limit, as much as you want to give away all of your free cider, you have to, cap it sometimes. So many founding fathers, too many apples.
Catherine, you have a fun cartoon of Henry Harrison, remember?
Yeah, so related, it's kind of similar to George Washington. He, his second race for the House of Burgesses, he served apple cider. He served cider and other liquors to encourage people to vote for him. So William Henry Harrison, who won the presidential campaign of 1840, is not known for much because his term lasted 30 some days. But when he was running for president, his campaign used the platform and the campaign slogan of a log cabin and hard cider. So they got it from a Richmond newspaper editorial that was trying to dismiss Harrison, who had been a war hero, and basically saying he was too old, he was too common, and they said that you could give him a barrel of hard cider and a pension of $2,000 a year, and he will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin. Like he's nobody. He's just gonna, fade away. But the Harrison campaign loved this. They took it, they ran with it, and said, this is the campaign of log cabins and apples and hard ciders, and we're of the people, right? And so Harrison served cider at all of his rallies, and you can see they used it in political cartoons as well. So this is from the 1840 presidential race, the People's Line. You see the locomotive that's made of hard cider and a log cabin. And it's knocking over incumbent Martin Van Buren, who's riding Uncle Sam's cab. So hard cider did have a very important role to play in this particular election. But I have another image from around the same time, 1854, and this is called the county election. And you see all the men lining up, going to cast their vote. And if you look over in the corner, you do have a man who would not have been eligible to vote. There's a black man here serving cider to voters who are gathered for the election. And I love kind of behind in the line, you see this one guy who maybe took a little bit too much cider, and he's being held up by his friend to go cast his ballot.
I love the guy in the back on the horse, the silhouette.
Oh, yeah.
You can tell he's had a drink, he's voted, and he's ready to go on with his day.
Yeah.
Every time I look at this image, I see something new.
Something new, yeah. So, I mean, this was kind of, elections were a party. And, sometimes it's whoever had the best alcohol. So
Definitely.
that was, so Apple did have a role in a number of presidents. And part of the reason we chose apples for January is because there is an inauguration coming up. So there's that tie to presidents. At least that's why I thought it was a good idea. There's some other small presidential connections. Abraham Lincoln served briefly as a tavern keeper in Springfield, Illinois, and sold Applejack at 12.5 cents a pint. Why anyone would drink a pint of Applejack is beyond me. That is apparently what the letters say. And FDR actually loved Applejack as well, and he used Applejack in his Manhattans, in his Manhattan cocktails. So that was like the special thing that he would do with
You can
Applejack.
still purchase, it's Laird's, right? That Laird's Brewery, which is one of the oldest, and they're still producing Applejack.
Yeah, so up until like last year or 2 years ago, Laird's Distillery in New Jersey was the only Applejack producer, and they are one of the oldest distilleries in the country. I think they started in 1717 or something like that. And so they were known for their Applejack. Another name for Applejack is Jersey Lightning, because of Laird's, because Laird's became so famous for it. And actually, another presidential connection, Robert Laird, so the son of the founder of the distillery, actually served with George Washington in the Revolutionary War, and I guess brought some Applejack with him on campaign or something. Somehow George Washington tasted Laird's Applejack, really liked it, went home to Mount Vernon, had all these apples he had no idea what to do with, and so he wrote to Robert Laird asking for the family recipe. And presumably he got it.
I don't think anybody ever said no to Washington.
Yeah. And apparently the copper still that Washington used for making his Applejack is now on display at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in Washington. So
Crushed it.
Mary, I have a question for you. Why is New York called the Big Apple?
That's a great question. I think I went around in circles, hoops, and at least until the 8th page of Google, which is unheard of for me. From what I can tell, I have the dates written down because it was such a weird, okay, so it starts in 1924. John J. Fitzgerald, to Fitz and Gerald, columnist covering the horse racing for the New York Morning Telegraph, wrote about going to the Big Apple, and he created this little tiny logo for his column. So when they asked him where they got that nickname from, he had overheard 2 Black men talking about going to New York, going to the Big Apple, and hitting it big. No follow-up was done to find those 2 men or to find out where that phrase came from, because that would have been too easy. The logo kind of died for a little bit. It died off. It basically died with his column. And then in the 70s and the 80s, when New York was trying to revamp its economic presence and its whole, people stopped thinking that the Bronx is burning. They want to revamp and rebrand themselves essentially. So they bring back this phrase. So it's done through the bureau's agency and the marketing agencies in New York City, and they start calling it the Big Apple to bring in tourists. There's no other fun reason except for that. So whoever branded that and copyrighted that did a great job. I know there have been petitions to kind of name streets as Big Apple Corner, mostly in Times Square, but there's no fun story as to there was a giant apple tree in the middle of New York City and that's how we got this name, or some grand connection. It's just really good branding, which again is very type A for New York City.
Well, a lot of known apple varieties and popular apple varieties come from the New York area.
We do have a large apple growing population. The Angry Orchard cider that I'm drinking now is from New York. So we are a big producer of apples, but I wish it had that connection of like somebody going, I'm going to go work on an orchard field for apples. But it was just like two guys telling us that they were going to go to the Big Apple, and nobody decided to go find out what that slang meant. So.
Well, I do know that back in, I think it was 2009, kind of playing off the Big Apple nickname, there was a petition for the Northern Spy apple, which is a variety of apple, to become the official apple of New York City. I don't know why the Northern Spy, or no, it was the Newtown Pippin. There's too many varieties of apples, but it was the Newtown Pippin. So the Newtown Pippin was the most popular apple grown in the 18th century. And it was used for just about everything. It was a great eating apple, it was a great cooking apple, and it was an excellent cider apple. So it was the first commercially grown apple variety, and it was discovered in Queens. So is discovered in Newtown Village, which is now Elmhurst, Queens. And it kind of propagated from there. But Thomas Jefferson was known to say that, Europe doesn't have, their apples were terrible because they didn't have the Newtown Pippin.
Yeah, that sounds
paraphrase, but
that sounds very Jefferson.
That was the gist. So I know I showed this kind of early on and skipped over it, but I did mention there were 14,000 named varieties of apples by the end of the 19th century. And these are just like some pictures of apples that were grown, either originated or grown in the state of Connecticut in the 18th century or early 19th century. And so you can see there's a bunch of different ones. You see the Newtown Pippin is at the end of the second row. So the starred names are ones that come from Connecticut. So we have the black gillyflower, which I love because it's this like gorgeous purple color. And the Chenango strawberry, which is from Chenango County, Connecticut. The Northern Spy, which is another popular cider apple, and the pumpkin sweet. So those are all from Connecticut. They were first discovered in Connecticut and then spread from there. The one thing I love about the Northern Spy, so it was a very popular apple as well. It was probably, after the Newtown Pippin, it was the most popularly grown apple variety in the 1800s. And, but in 1953, during the Red Scare, the news staff at the Toronto Globe and Mail sent a case of Northern Spy apples to Senator Joseph McCarthy. And then they proceeded to write an article about it in their newspaper, basically, and the headline just read, Northern Spies to Senator McCarthy. So that was, but one of the things I love about apple varieties is the names, right? So in the bottom corner, you have like the Westfield Seek No Further, which is from Westfield, Massachusetts. So you have different, either they're named for their color or shape or where they were discovered or some particular feature of, of the apple. So the pumpkin sweet is a very sweet apple.
I had a pink lady this morning with breakfast. Yeah. I had something that was labeled a dragon the other day that I picked up at the farmer's market, and I went, sold, because that sounds weird.
Yeah. So this is just like a handful, and not all of these apples are grown anymore. And unfortunately, that's one of the things about apples, because they are this extreme heterozygote where you can't reproduce apple varieties through seed. You have to actually graft from the original tree. is that once all the trees are gone, you can't get that apple again. And so most of these apples are still grown, heirloom trees in small orchards, but some of these are no longer around. And actually, I don't have a picture of it because it is no longer around, but there was an apple that was popular in the 1800s called the baker's apple, because it was discovered here in Ridgefield by Dr. Amos Baker. And it was discovered in the late 1700s. Apparently, it was fairly well known in this kind of Fairfield County, Westchester County region, but it's now gone because the tree and all the trees that had grafted from it are gone. But it was described as a red apple of good size, pretty uniform in shape, and it was not good as a keeper, so it didn't keep as well fresh, but it was better than the Baldwin apple. That was all the description is. It was better than the Baldwin.
That's a lot of description. It's very vague. It's just like, we've got this thing, it exists.
Yeah.
Hope for the best.
Catherine, can you show us the apple peeler? Did you bring it out?
Oh yeah, sure. So let me make
that's really a cool tool.
A little bit of space. So this is an apple parer, I guess is what it was called. We didn't peel apples, we pared apples in the 18th century. So I'm trying to see if you can see. So there's a little platform at the bottom here that you would actually sit on to secure your apple parer. And unfortunately, we are missing the most important part of the apple parer, which is where the knife is held. But that would kind of go on the top. And I have a knife here. So it would be positioned, trying to see how is best to show you. Kind of here, it would be held in place, and you would just put it up against your apple, and then you would rotate, and your apple would spin with this is not going, there we go. And then it would get pared off by the knife. So this is a typical style 18th century apple parer. And I imagine it was probably the job of maybe one of the older kids to help Esther Keeler pare her apples.
I couldn't imagine storing that in my kitchen drawers.
Yeah, well, it has a very handy hole where you can hang it on the wall.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
So that's really cool that we have that. And then something else we had in our collection, I noticed there was a question kind of early on about apple butter in the chat. So apple butter and applesauce were another way of keeping apples long term. And so to make apple butter, you really have to cook, or apple preserves too, like an apple jam. You really have to cook them for a long time, and you have to get it up to a really high temperature. And I make apple jam in the fall for Christmas cookies. And one thing I've noticed about apples when you're cooking them a lot is that they have a tendency to pop, right? And kind of spew really hot jam all over the place. And so the 18th century solution to that was to use a apple butter stir that has a really long stick, really long handle. And this is our short one. We have another one that is 5.5 feet long. It's got a 5.5 foot long handle on it. But you could then stick this really cool kind of stirring end into your copper pot of apple butter or apple jam and give it a stir around. So I thought that was really interesting, a really cool thing.
Yeah, there's a whole science behind it. You have to put the more sour apples on the bottom and the sweeter ones on top because they cook differently. And
yeah,
it's this New York City kitchen. I've never attempted to do anything like that. I probably never will, but
yeah. And I mean, I know it's one of the things, if you're cooking over an open fire, you really have to keep stirring things, otherwise it'll scorch.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even on an electric stove, that's possible too. So, you know, but if you have to stand right over this giant copper pot of apples over the fire, and they're like bursting hot jam and butter everywhere, you want to stand 5.5 feet away.
Definitely.
So
Yeah.
in terms of preservation, Kathleen and Mary, you know, is there something remarkable about how people would preserve? Canning, when was that already an option?
They would have most likely, when they did the apple sauces and the apple butters, they would have done the preservation. They would have put it in barrels and they would have put it into the cellars. And those were better because you didn't have to do any prep work for it. So you would take it out of the barrels and maybe warm it up a little bit and eat it as is, which was great. So you've already put in your work. You've already maybe put in your 3rd-degree burn. So when you did get to go back to eat it in the wintertime, it wasn't as dangerous.
Yeah. So yeah, apple butter and applesauce is one way to preserve it. Apple cider, obviously another. And then if you, for some reason, don't finish all of your apple cider, it will continue to ferment into apple cider vinegar, which you can then use to preserve other produce. And actually, you can also use apple cider vinegar for another 18th century beverage called switchel, which was the 18th century's answer for Gatorade. It was kind of an energy drink. And it's made with, the recipe I found says you take a gallon of water and then you put in, so a gallon of fresh water and then half a cup of a sweetener, either molasses, maple syrup, or honey, a 1/4 cup of cider vinegar, and a heaping tablespoon of ginger. And you kind of mix that all together, and then you can take it out out into the field with you. Another name for switchel is haymaker's punch, because they would bring it with them when they went to do all the haying. And so there's actually a very specific type of container you would carry your switchel in, and it's a ring. So this is a switchel container, and you would stop it up, and you could actually, if there was a cool stream nearby, you could actually just stick the switchel into the stream, and it would stay nice and cool, which is great on a hot summer day when you're working. And that was actually the function of the ginger, was because if you ever had like a really cold drink when you're really hot, it actually kind of upsets your stomach. So the ginger was to kind of soothe your stomach when you had your cold switchel.
Yeah, you would describe this as a Gatorade, but it definitely comes off as like a good hangover cure in the morning.
Kathleen, explain the shape of the container you just showed us.
Okay, so there's a couple of theories as to why switchel was in this kind of ring-shaped vessel. One was that you could like put it over the pommel of your saddle. Like you could kind of like hook it over that and keep it that way. The other reason is if you are putting in like a stream or you want to keep it cool, there's additional surface area that like the cool water of the stream would run over, so it would keep the switchel nice and cold. So that's kind of two theories as to why it was this very strange, unusual shape. But I haven't found any like reason, 100% this was why they did it that way. Or maybe it was just so it's easy to identify. If you're not expecting switchel, I don't think you would be very happy to just drink switchel. So I mean, that could be another, reason.
Right. So we're going over an hour. So if anybody has a question, you want to please put it in the chat and we will let our presenters know. Kathy, you had also done some research on Richfield and the the cider mills in town?
Yeah. So Ridgefield it was a farming community. So as I mentioned several times, everybody had these orchards. So there were several cider mills in the town of Ridgefield. Now for reference, the town of Ridgefield had, in the 18th century, had about 2,000 people in it. So by the 19th century, there were about 6 cider mills in the town of Ridgefield. And oftentimes they were also grist mills, so they did flour and grain, as well as apples for cider. And one of the cider mills in town was operated by a man named Isaac Keeler, who is one of Timothy Keeler's relatives, like a second cousin or something like that. And he owned a grist mill, cider mill, and his mill was actually burned down during the Battle of Ridgefield in 1777. So the Battle of Ridgefield in April of 1777, the British actually came up from Long Island Sound and they burned down the city of Norwalk, and on their way back to their ships, they came through Ridgefield and they caused a lot of destruction, and there was a actual engagement fighting on Ridgefield's main street. So on the British, their way through the northern part of Ridgefield, they did burn down Isaac Keeler's grist mill and cider mill. And for those who know the town of Ridgefield, the northern part of town, there's a very specific neighborhood called Bungtown. This is where Isaac Keeler's mill was. And one of the theories for the origin of the name Bungtown is because the bungs, those corks that are on the sides of barrels, during the burning of the mill, those bungs started popping out of the barrels and it sounded like gunshots. So that's one of the theories why this part of town is called Bungtown. So Isaac Keeler was one of the cider mills in Ridgefield. And then in the mid-19th century, there was another Keeler, another relation of somewhere along the tree, a man named Hull Keeler, who operated a distillery. And his distillery was known to produce cider brandy, which I mentioned way at the beginning is just is applejack that's been steam distilled rather than freezing distillation. So he was known to make cider brandy here in Ridgefield as well. And then the very last apple connection that Ridgefield has is was a gentleman in 1881 named Elias Keeler who, I don't know what happened.
Too many apples.
Yeah. So, okay, here we go. Elias Keeler, or not Elias Keeler, Elias Hoyt. I don't know what's going on. Here, he patented a cider press, an improvement on the cider press in 1881 that used kind of a conveyor belt system. So instead of kind of pressing down on those masses of apple cheese, you would feed a thin layer through these two rollers, and it would press out the apple cider. I don't know that this particular improvement on the cider press ever caught on. I couldn't find any record of anyone ever having built one of these. And as far as I know, everyone still likes either the screw press or the lever press. And so I don't know that this went anywhere, but I thought that was interesting that he was kind of thinking about how do I make the cider press. more efficient, I guess. The other thing I found interesting is this was patented in 1881, which is kind of pretty late in the decline of cider in America. So cider was super popular in the 18th century and the early 19th century, but it kind of lost popularity throughout the 19th century. And then it was finally the hard cider, in America was pretty much killed off with Prohibition. And it's only recently that it returned, it's kind of come back.
So Catherine, I have two related questions that relate to when cider was still very popular, like in 1700s. So one is, was there like a cider contest, in who made the best cider type of thing? And the other question came in early, and it was, would they have a special celebration when they would open up the first, cider of the season, so to speak, the first barrel?
That's interesting. I don't think so. Yeah, as far as I know, there wasn't any kind of like cider contest, like you have like whiskey judging, or like, the wine, connoisseurs, they all judge. I don't think there was that kind of cider. I think because
it was also different. There was no way to keep it at the same, like every barrel would have tasted a little bit different. So maybe not competition, but I think if there was some sort of like ribbon cutting ceremony for a new tavern, there definitely was a lot of like free samples. Check out what we've got here.
Yeah. And I think because everybody would have had different types of apples, right? So everybody's cider is going to be different. You're either going to have a different mix of apples, or you're going to have, your unique apples that are going to give it a specific taste. So I don't think there's any sort of widespread judging. And I couldn't find any references to like specific celebrations around cider. I know in England, there's the history of wassail, which is kind of your honoring the apple trees themselves with cider. But in North America, they might have kind of continued wassail practices for a bit, but I didn't see any references to it.
So are any of these 18th century varieties still available today?
Yeah, Northern Spies, you can still buy Northern Spies. And also the Newtown Pippin is still produced. Mostly it's actually used for cider, and Martinelli's sparkling cider is actually, they use Newtown Pippins.
Golden Delicious is still available as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know and that. Then, sorry. There are also like small apple orchards are kind of bringing back, if they can, these heirloom varieties. So, there is a website called New England Apple. I think it's newenglandapple.com that has like hundreds of varieties, and they also tell you if there are apple orchards in the New England region that grow specific varieties of apples. So that's a really cool resource that I had a ton of fun just kind of scrolling through.
Yeah, apples were a lot more interesting when I went down a weird Google hole and started learning about like things and stuff. And you're like, this really is truly, when you think of America, you think of apple pie. It really is more apple than apple pie.
Yeah, it's apple cider.
It's an apple cider. That's right.
It's better to cheers with an apple cider.
Today, a lot of the, we got West Coast states like Oregon and Washington. That's where, we have a lot of our apples, right? So it's moved west, actually.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that as people moved into the frontier and moved west, they brought their apples with them. People know this story of Johnny Appleseed, kind of growing apples everywhere. So this partly correct. The apple, Johnny Chapman, who's known as Johnny Appleseed, he was a missionary who went out to the Midwest and kind of ahead of the main migration and planted apple orchards and nurseries so that when people eventually made it out to Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, there were apple tree seedlings and saplings available for them, because an apple tree takes about 6 to 10 years to start producing fruit. So Johnny Appleseed went out ahead of time to grow these trees and get them ready for all of the settlers who were coming west. So slowly, as European settlers moved into the frontier, they brought their apples with them.
Great. Do we have any other questions for our wonderful presenters? This has been fascinating, you guys. Really
I definitely liked doing the research on this one.
Yeah.
And I'm the lucky one. I get a heads up because I get to see it all. So I've learned so much. It's really, it's great. It's wonderful. I love your maps, Mary. They're great.
I wish I can call the Ratzner map mine, but I have to share it with other people at the museum.
Yeah. And Catherine, your demonstration was cool.
I did appreciate the apple peeler.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because I mean, it's kind of the same if you had those like apple peeler core things.
Yeah, that's what it reminded me of.
Your countertop. I mean, it's the same idea.
Yeah, I can already see your like as seen on TV commercial for one of us to bring it back.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if we do not have any more questions, we thank you for attending. We hope you enjoyed it. As mentioned, you will be receiving a survey, so thank you so much for filling it out. We appreciate it, and then we hope to see you next time. It's February the 2nd, isn't it? I actually just hopped onto our Yes, and do we want to give away like the general what is it going to be about? Just to whet people's appetites
for next month?
Yep.
Carrots.
Okay. Whet your appetite for carrots.
It's going to be your favorite root vegetable by the time we're done with you.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening. Have a good night. And we will see you in a month. Thank you, Mary. And thank you, Catherine. Great job.
Good night, everybody.
Bye, everyone.